transition to the next set of lectures, after which we'll have this exam. We have two more to do. We've got to do this, what are class analyses and the misnomer, NOVE. We've got to do those two. Okay, and then we'll have our exam. Lenin's first stage of communism, or what is called socialism. It's called socialism, is what Lenin calls this first stage. The claim is by people who follow this kind of theory, and the people who follow it are often called orthodox Marxists. So within the Marxian tradition, they're called orthodox Marxists. And it's just about everybody in the non-Marxian condition, non-Marxian approach. So it's just kind of a universal acceptance of what is the first stage of communism and socialism outside of Marxism. And within Marxism, it's mainly by these orthodox Marxists. Number one, collective ownership of the means of production. And state planning of all the markets. That's the first kind of economic characteristic. And again, that comes from Mr. Engels and Mr. Kautsky, and even to a degree from Mr. Bernstein. Mr. Bernstein thinks that reforms will produce this collective ownership, rather than having the state intervene to nationalize the means of production, like Lenin and Kautsky and Engels. But in any case, if everybody on the right and a portion of the left have a kind of common agreement of what socialism is, which is collective ownership, not of everything, just of the means of production, and the absence of private markets, competitive markets, but the presence of planning. Second, it's the distribution of consumer goods on the basis of work performed. In other words, equal wages for equal work. That's that bourgeois right that Lenin mentioned. Third, society is understood to be one giant state factory and office. It's kind of the vision that there's kind of a big state-wide factory. It has its different branches. There's coal mining and steel and oil production and cars and so forth. But it's all encompassed under one big umbrella. State enterprises, it's typically called. And on top of the state enterprises, there would be a planning authority. The Soviet Union, it was called Gosplan, G-O-S-P-L-A-N. Kind of central planning authority that oversees this big factory, a big board of directors, maybe a few hundred people. And then the fourth one would be that the state would be there still would be a state because, remember I told you the problems, because you're distributing wealth on the basis of equal pay for equal work and not on the basis of need. So there still is a state present, but the state is under the control of an arm of the proletariat. Dictatorship of the proletariat. So it's an instrument of the workers, and it's called the Communist Party. That's the party that represents the interests of the workers of the state. So it's the vanguard of the workers, it's the Communist Party. That's the four things. And then we can kind of do an overview of all the countries around the world that were established under this kind of heading of socialism, and they all had, in one way or the other, these four characteristics. So there was a kind of commonality across them all. And that's the orthodox version, which, as I said, is adopted by much of the left and the right. It's kind of the version of the communist parties and the version, to make a joke, of the FBI. They kind of agreed on this. This is what socialism is. And many of you may have had this vision too. But there's another question to be asked, which now I'm going to turn to. Okay, there's another question. Suppose we do a Marxist analysis of this Marxist idea. We can then ask the question that Marx asked. It was his most important question. It was his most important question. Is, in a society, who produces, appropriates, and distributes the surplus labor? Because that's the thing he invented. So it's no wonder he thought it was an important question. In terms of this course, who are the exploiters and who are the exploited? And I taught you that. So we have that in that first exam before coming up, and so you're going to answer that. Who in the society produces the surplus and who gets it? Exploitation takes place if the workers produce the surplus, but they don't get that which they produce. That's what he was concerned with. So you can ask that question of these so-called socialist societies. You can ask the question, who there produced the surplus in agriculture and industry, and who got the surplus and then distributed it? You know, the two who's, who produced it and who appropriated it. The orthodoxy answers that question. Now, this is a review of what we've done. So we go back to Engels, but it's important that I review it so we all understand it. The orthodoxy answers the question by answering a different question, which is, who owns the means of production? So for Engels and Kautsky, even for Bernstein and for Lenin, the question of who appropriates the surplus is the answer to the question, who owns the means of production? So, for them, they deduce the appropriation of the surplus from ownership. Or they conflate the two. They just make them the same. If you own, you automatically appropriate. It's either they deduce one, they either deduce one from the other, or they just make them the same. And that's called determinism, which we called it before. So there is an essential deterministic cause of exploitation, which is ownership. Hence, you can see what they've done. If you have collective ownership of the means of production, such that the workers all own the means, if you've instituted that, then they automatically appropriate the surplus. What I'm going to teach you now is that that kind of reasoning is, in quotes, not correct. So we're going to present a criticism of that kind of reasoning, both on the left and the right. That's the importance of what we're going to do. Right. So we turn now to an approach. And the approach is in part B of your syllabus. We'll move now to part B. What are class analyses? That's a yes. Class analyses, not analysis. What are class analyses? Okay, so let's start. For everybody everybody on the left, all these socialists and communists and so forth, they want something in common, which is a society without class exploitation. That's what they want. That's their vision of a better society. One absent class exploitation. Sometimes it's called a classless society. So there's no more exploiters and exploited. That's what they want. How are the economic determinists going to get that? They want a classless society, no more class exploitation. So how is that to be accomplished? Yeah, man.
Those who produce the surplus are able to appropriate it?
Yes, and how is that to be accomplished? If you're an Orthodox, Leninist, or follower of Engels or Kautsky. Yes, sir.
Subsidize the means of production.
That's right. So do it again.
Socializing means of production.
Okay, so you got that logic. It really is how to bake a cake. It's a menu. Not a menu, I mean a cookbook. That's the power of deduction. So they deduce the absence of class exploitation. No class is present from the absence of private ownership of the means of production. It's one of the most important ideas in socialism in the 20th century. No minor potatoes. With this gentleman answer. Okay, so let's go back again. So they want a classless society, one absent of class exploitation. Here's a problem. It's a problem that's haunted Marxism, and it's actually haunted people outside Marxism. It's haunted the Marxian, non-Marxian approaches for a very long period of time. There's no common agreement on what is class. That's the problem. Everybody wants something, which is a classless society, but they don't agree on what classlessness means. Because why? Because they don't agree what class means. It's a fundamental problem. People talk as if they want the same thing, but they mean different things in terms of what they want. And it's not terribly surprising that they disagree violently, politically and intellectually, when it comes to the specificity of what they're advocating, because they don't agree in the terms. Okay, so let's take it in the most general way and build this up. Let's take the word class. Class literally means to classify a population, whatever it might be, into various characteristics. Think of a human being. We have an infinite set of characteristics. And hence we can classify individuals in a population according to these characteristics that they have or they don't have. For example, one easy one, if you can classify a population into a class of men and women. You hear that all the time. You can classify a population in terms of young and old. You can classify a population into the tall and short, rich and poor, elite and not elite, black and white. Okay? It just goes on. And then you can have composites of these. You can have rich males versus poor males. It's not as if you make complications here. So you can have an endless set of classes depending upon your classification. Not terribly surprising. In social theory, that is within Marxian and non-Marxian approaches, like at the university, within social theory, there are typically some traditional class groupings that you run into. And these class groupings are typically used in political discourse, like in the United States, on television, in the movies, and so forth. There's kind of some typical ones that we use. Here's one. There is a property classification. That is, one could divide a population into those who own property and those who do not. That's a classification. A class of owners, property owners, and a class of people who do not own property. Within the Marxian tradition, you can have a group of people, here's a classification, who own the means of production, that is the capital, the plant equipment, and those who do not. Like, who would be there? Well, Engels, Kautsky, Lenin, Bernstein, and 8,000 others. That is one of the most typical classifications within and without the Marxian tradition. You divide a population into the property and the property-less class. And you can have gradations. You can have people who have a lot of property, people who don't have much, and you have people in between. You know, people who have a kind of not as much as the really property class, but more than those people who don't have any property. That's the one that Lenin used. So Lenin writes a book on Russia before the Great Revolution in 1917, in which he does a classification, a class analysis of Russian agriculture, where the vast majority of the population lived at that time, like 70% of the people there, and he classified them according to the number of horses that they own, the amount of land that they own. Very sophisticated classification. So he had sometimes 5 different kinds of classes. Those that owned a lot of horses and a lot of land, those that didn't own any, and then all the gradations in between. Very complex classification. So for these individuals, socialism abolishes this kind of class division. Well, how and why? Because it endows workers, all the workers, with ownership over the means of production. It democratizes ownership by getting rid of the class division in society by what? Nationalizing ownership, so that if you're a citizen of the society, you become an owner of the means of production. First thing that the Soviets did when they came to power in the USSR, they abolished private ownership of the means of production. First thing that they did in all the East European countries, and in China, all over the place. So, getting rid of the private ownership of the means of production gets rid of the class structure, eliminates it, and produces a classless society. Here is a different kind of classification. It's related to this one, but it's slightly different. You can divide a society, a population, into income groupings. What does that mean? Well, you divide a population into those who are rich and those who are poor. That's a different classification. It's not the same as the property one. It's related, but it's slightly different. Here, the size of income determines the classes in society, the rich versus the poor. So, according to this one, the United States, over much of its history, was becoming a classless society because we were doing what? We were creating an enormous middle class, which meant that we were abolishing the class of poor, abolishing the class of rich, and everybody was in this middle class. The great accomplishment of capitalism was to abolish its class structure. And then today, increasingly people are worried about, in politics, in Congress, and other parts of society, once again, we are becoming a class society because the middle class is shrinking. And too many of the people are falling into the poor classes of society, out of the middle. And so once again, we're having a very unequal distribution of income in society in which too much of the income goes to too few people. That's shown up by the U.S. statistics on income distribution of the states. It looks now at 2010 like it did in 1926, just before the Great Depression. So people worry about that once again we're introducing a class structure in the U.S. because of this unequal distribution of income in American society. That's a very different. So what's socialism according to this view? Well, socialism would be a society that abolishes capitalist income inequality. People used to make jokes that socialism was accomplished in the United States by capitalism. That was used to be a cute little joke because we abolished this inequality, but now people are worried that the inequality is being reintroduced. And capitalism is reintroducing this inequality, whereas it abolished it for 200 years of its history. So socialism is a society in which, basically, you have an equal distribution of income. giant middle class. That's like Lenin's first stage of communism. Equal pay for equal work. Let me give you a third one. So we've got the property definition, we've got the income definition. I'll give you the third one. Very different than these first two. Here, these people divide a society in terms of power groupings. This is a political understanding. It's not an economic understanding. This one here says, I will divide a population into a class of individuals who wield power, powerful, versus a class of individuals who do not wield any power, the powerless. The powerful versus the powerless. The ruling class versus the ruled. You ready? This is what is being done in analyses of Egypt today that you hear on TV and radio and so forth. So people do it, they do a class analysis of Egypt, you hear it, what do they say? It's the elites, that's the word they use, elites, the people who have power, versus everybody else. And so there's a revolt against this small group of elites who have been controlling Egyptian society for so many decades by the people who have no any power. They have the power to vote, they don't have the power to do anything. So they're revolted, they want democracy, they want to demote the elite so that they have power. It's a revolution of power. That's the current analysis of Egypt. It's not an income analysis. It's not a property analysis, it's a power analysis. That analysis is most popular in states when we do our analyses of these revolts. So socialism, from this approach, would be a society which has eliminated the power of the capitalists. That is, no longer can capitalists order the behavior of workers. The workers rise up, and they have power in their hands. That's Mr. Bernstein. That's, to a degree, Mr. Lenin. Socialism then abolishes the inequality of power, for the power theorist. It eliminates class oppression. That's Mr. Bernstein. Notice the differences here now. We've got enough. Those are your main understandings within and without the Marxian tradition. Both in the people that we've presented so far and the people that we haven't even talked about, in the popular press today, in the States and elsewhere. So what's the difference between these approaches? How they can differ and argue with one another, despite the fact they never articulate what it is they're arguing about. A property theorist may say the following. Let's take Mr. Engels, Mr. Lenin, Mr. Kautsky, and even to a degree Mr. Bernstein. Socialism has been achieved in a society, that is the first stage of communism, when either the state or the workers themselves being Bernstein, state under Lenin, when either the state or the workers have in one way or the other instituted collective ownership of the means of production. So how do you know that all those countries that I listed, other countries, Hungary, Poland, and so forth, the former Soviet Union, how do you know they were socialists? Because they had instituted, like one of you said, collective ownership of the means of production, planning, blah, 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 blah. It was just doing the collective ownership here. Hence, they abolished exploitation. Suppose a power theorist. Now, the power theorist is using a different understanding of class. Comes back and says, yes, I agree with you. You have collectivized the means of production. That is, the Communist Party seized the state, got rid of private ownership, and instituted instead collective ownership of the means of production. I agree, you've done that. Or, follow what Bernstein says, yes, we've dispersed ownership of the means of production over the citizens by these reforms. Yes, we've done all that. But, says the power theorist, the power still rests in the hands of a small group of individuals. In the case of socialism, the power still rests in the hands of a small group of state bureaucrats who control, use their power to control the state enterprises, as the result of nationalization, to control the use of the means of production in those state enterprises, and who control the workers themselves in terms of the hours they work, what they do, and their pay, and so forth. Hence, say these power theorists, this is not true socialism because the workers still don't have power over their lives. In fact, as one gentleman once said, this is a degenerate socialism. His name was Trotsky, Trotsky, Leon Trotsky. He was a power theorist and a very famous socialist. So he argued against what Stalin had accomplished. They were contemporaries of one another. Both helped to make the revolution in the Soviet Union. Both had read Marx. Trotsky was a brilliant theorist. Stalin was a power theorist. Trotsky was a power theorist. And they had two different visions of what is socialism. So Trotsky said, yes, it's good. We have collectivized means of production, Stalin, bravo, but you have not finished the revolution. So he entitled one of his works, Trotsky, The Unfinished Revolution. You didn't finish it. What you would have to do is to go after the distribution of power. Too much power is vested in too few hands in the society, and they happen to be state officials. These planners who are planning all of this, these vanguard of the Communist Party, that said, you yourself, Stalin, you got too much power, and although we have ownership vested in the hands of the workers, those workers cannot make use of the power that the laws of the land give them. Because the power is concentrated in too few hands. They don't have the power to make their decisions. So the revolution is not finished. It's not a true socialism.
Was his solution like a direct democracy?
No one knows. What he wanted was a revolution in which the power would be in the hands of the workers. So it could be, for him, it would be, you've got to get rid of these state bureaucrats and allow the workers to vote across the land in terms of how it would be like the workers. If you own a piece of stock, you have the right to vote. For what? In terms of the corporations, you would have this collective farm and factory. You would have the right to vote across the land on the hours of your work, the wages, and so forth, etc. Rather than having that power vested in a few hands of a state party or state managers or whatever.
So more about collective enterprise?
Can you raise your hand? Yeah.
More of a collective enterprise then?
Pardon?
Would you believe in more of a collective enterprise?
No. It's got nothing to do with that. What he believed in was whatever kind of enterprise we had, the power had to be vested in the hands of the workers themselves, in whatever kind of enterprise they were. If you continued state enterprises, which I'm sure he would be happy with, then in those large state enterprises, then let's say the unions in those enterprises, the union of workers would have to have the power of they would have to get together periodically, be presented with plans, and decide what they're going to do. So length of the workday, how much they're going to pay, what's done with the surplus, and so forth. Let me take one in the, since that's on the Soviet Union, let me take one for the United States. Let's go back to Mr. Bernstein. Here was an argument that was presented, and it still may be presented in business schools and other places. Wall Street Journal. It's a very popular argument. A property theorist may claim, as I said, there's no longer a class structure in the United States. So this is really a follower of Bernstein, but it goes way beyond Bernstein. I'm not sure people who write for the journal Wall Street Journal have ever read Resnick, so it's covered beyond. Other people have made this kind of argument. The United States is no longer there's no longer a capitalist class. They don't like those words. There's no longer a class denotes division of society and tension. So there's no longer a capitalist class structure in the United States because the ownership of property has been democratized. So, everybody now is an owner through their pension plans and so forth of the means of production. You and I, anybody, can own the means of production by buying a share of stock. And that gives us the right to control the corporation under the law. Okay? So that's a reform. You got new kinds of laws. The corporations have to be incorporated. The minute they get incorporated, they create a problem, which is that the ownership of those corporations, when issue stock, are in the hands of the stock owners, the common stock owners. And hence, anyone in this room, if you own enough shares, you can vote yourself or your friends or your family, whatever, into the board of directors. You have a right to control the corporation. So, the argument goes, if we've done that in the United States, we've abolished the class structure. You can see how cute this would get. It's capitalism that abolishes the class structure, not socialism. Why? Because capitalism extends the idea of ownership to the market. You buy shares of stock in the stock market. You get that kind of ironic twist. A power theorist comes back to the States and argues the following. Yes, we've done that. But we have introduced a new kind of class structure in the United States. The power theorist. Why? Because now in corporations, we have a small group of managers on the board of directors in the top echelon of these corporations who control the corporations even though they don't own the shares of stock. And here's the famous quote. These individuals, these managerial elites, they have, that's the title of the book, power without property. So this book was written in 1932 in the United States by two Americans who had nothing to do with socialism. Gardner Means and Adolf Berlin, Berlin Means. They write a book I believe in 1932 in which they describe what has happened in America, which is it's no longer a population stratified by property, but rather by one of power in which a small group of people who sit on the boards of directors of these corporations and who are the president, CEOs, and CFOs, chief executive officers, and chief financial officers, who run the corporations, who make all the decisions. That's the class. It is called a new managerial class. So they write this in 32, but in late 1940s and 50s, it had drifted into the popular imagination, and so Hollywood began to make movies about this. In which the movies would portray a new class, a managerial revolution had occurred in the States, in which this new class of managers living in the suburbs of Connecticut were the elite that were running America. And all the contradictions of their lives, that was the movies, what the movies were about. Paul Newman was classic in writing and playing these people, these managers. Working in Manhattan, living in Connecticut, Stamford, Connecticut, okay, and having the power over people's lives, but having very little, if any, profit. So you can see how these people differ with one another. And then, of course, people would come back and say, look, that managerial elite that you're writing about, I agree with that, but I'm going to show you how that managerial elite also has property ownership. So you get a debate going back and forth amongst these people. But the point is they had different notions of class. Marx comes up with a still different notion. He was aware of these other notions. He understood very well the power notion. He understood very well the property notion. Those are very old. The property notion goes back to the Bible. So he's well aware of it. It goes back to the Bible, and it goes back to Aristotle. The property notion in the Bible. I'm not good at this, but in the New Testament, Christ says to his disciples at one point, "Throw down your property at my feet so I can distribute them to the poor." That's a property notion of class. So they're the property. You got to throw down their property at the feet of Christ, and he will then distribute them to the poor. That's the kind of utopian image. It's very old. I mean, that exists in the New Testament, the Bible. The property notion exists in the work of Aristotle. The power notion has existed for long periods of time, elite and non-elite. Marx comes up with a different notion of class, okay, which is the one that we have talked about in this class. His notion is in terms of the organization of surplus. That's not a property and that's not a power. Is it related? Of course, everything is related to everything else. But there's just a different meaning of class. Here, one divides a population into those who produce the surplus and those who get that produced surplus and distribute the surplus. So, this is a different classification than the power, the property, and the income. This is a classification in terms of surplus labor. Just like the power definition is different than the property, the surplus is different than the power, and it's different than the property. And of course, different than the income. So let's go through now in your reading. The fundamental class process describes, in what are class analyses, describes a situation in which people produce and appropriate the surplus. The subsumed class process describes a situation in which they distribute the surplus that they have received, appropriated. Okay, so let's go back. Because it's been some time, I've been covering all these different theories, and so you, like me, we forget. So people do necessary labor in capitalism, and they do surplus labor in capitalism, and that's the total labor that they perform. So I can't remember the example I gave you, but suppose this were, 4 hours plus 4 hours, be 8 hours to perform. So we have the total 8 hours being performed. And then, of course, the necessary labor times its productivity, that's wealth. The surplus labor times its productivity, that's wealth. And that's the total wealth being produced. So this is the consumption of the workers. And this is the extra. What's extra? You want the profits equal to the total wealth. Suppose it's capitalism. As I taught you, in capitalism, labor power is a commodity, different from these other feudalism and slavery. So labor power is a commodity. What does that mean? It's being bought and sold. So people have the right to sell their capacity to work. And if you remember, what we did is people got a value for their labor power, which is a wage, the value of their labor power. That's their wage. Then they go out, and what do? They buy their consumer goods. To do what? To sustain themselves, to reproduce themselves as workers. So, labor power is a commodity and sold by workers. Serfs can't sell, slaves can't sell, ancients don't sell, but capitalist workers do sell. Remember, that's one of the facts that Mr. Engels talks about. One of the great facts. People have the freedom to sell their capacity to produce. So capitalism heralds a new freedom, which is the market, the buying and selling of labor power. So workers sell their labor power, they go to work for their 8 hours, they get a wage, the value of their labor power, that's their consumption. So they do necessary labor, they work for a period of time, the total labor, the 8 hours, they work for a period of time, and they produce wealth. The wealth is sold by their employer, and a portion of it is given to them as wages. So that's literally, this is the necessary labor that they work. Necessary to produce a set of goods and services which will cover their wages. What does the buyer get? We're redoing what we did. The buyer of the labor power gets the use value of labor power, which is the 8 hours of work, the actual labor performed. 8 hours. And if that labor yields more in value than it costs, it's a surplus value. So if this yields $8, if this yields $8, then 8 minus 4 is the surplus value of $4. So if the capitalist can be in the position of getting the use value of labor power, which is the actual labor performed, this is the 8 hours, the 8 hours times its yield. So 8 hours times $1 per hour gives us our $8. The yield of use value of labor power, and hence there's our profit of surplus value, which is this right over here. Okay, that's the review. So let's go back and let's tie it to what we've done. A communist society, according to Marx and according to this surplus definition, is when the collectivity of workers produces this $4, but also gets it. Communism, from the surplus labor notion, communism, or the first stage of communism, or whatever, socialism, is a society in which there is in place an organization in which the workers produce a surplus, because you need this for any society. They produce a surplus, but they're in the position to get the surplus that they produce. Let's go to the blackboard. And again, I'm aware we did this a month ago. You could have a wage labor system present in communism. You could have the presence of a market, wage labor market. We have on the blackboard, we have a wage labor market. We have a wage here for these communist workers. But what must also be present? So this is a private market, no planet. This is the presence of a private market, but what also must be present, according to this class definition, for there to be no class exploitation? If the workers have to be in the position to get the $4 that they produce, what do you need from the black? Yeah, man.
You have to get rid of profits,
No, there's still profits. I told you there's still a surplus.
but redistribute it to the workers.
How do the workers get in the position of getting the profits that they produce? That's the question. You still got profits. Yeah?
You need to get rid of the ownership.
No, that's wrong. That's not what I did in the blackboard. I didn't mention, when I did all this crap, I didn't mention ownership.
Pay them the value of the actual labor performed.
Then there'll be no surplus.
Somehow include that in the appropriation of the surplus.
Huh?
Include that in the appropriation of the surplus.
How do you do that? Yes, way back. Yes, sir.
So that the workers themselves decide what their surplus labor will go towards.
We're getting closer and closer. Yeah?
Political power?
How do
You include that you not only socialize the means of production, but you also give them political power.
No, I didn't mention that. I mean, possibly. I just didn't mention ownership and I didn't mention power. Those are other definitions. I'm only giving you the surplus definition. Yeah?
Give each worker equal ownership over the company.
I just said no.
Oh, sorry.
And you'll fail the course.
Planning?
No, I just said no. Okay, so here's the answer. Here's what you're doing. Your answers are interesting. Planning and power, those are not this class definition. They're different. But you have in your heads, which I understand, these other notions of class. That's not the organization of surplus. The answer to this, which some of you are very close to, is the workers have to be in the position to get the use value of their labor power. They have to be in the position to get the $8 in this labor market, pay themselves the $4, and have that surplus of $4, that profits left over, which they will use for all kinds of reasons, not the least of which, to pay people, cultural providers, to teach everybody what I just did. So there'll be no mistake of the absence of class exploitation. The workers have to be in the position to get the surplus as a collectivity that they just produced. The only way that's possible by this logic is that the workers have to be in the position to get the use value of their own labor power so that they can get the $8 or the 8 hours, pay themselves consumption, and have what's left in their own hands, which they then distribute. You ready now? Let's jump right away. And then I'll come back and I'll do it again. What has this got to do with private or collective? What has this got to do with ownership of the means of production? Which is your question. What has this got to do with the ownership of the means of production? Is there any necessary link between the ownership of machines and factories and what we just did? That's the question. Any necessary link? No. It's quite possible to have this collective, to have this, let's give it a label, this communist fundamental class process with private ownership of the means of production. Everybody in the society, including the workers, could be private owners. You could have the laws of the culture present in which the workers, whoever else, privately own the means of production. No collective ownership. But the workers still could be in the place to get the use value of the labor power. Let's take planning. Is this possible with markets? We just did it with markets. It was quite possible to have a market system and all the good and bad with a market system, just like a private ownership, and yet still have the communist fundamental class process. Let's put it all together now. This is a criticism of all the authors you have read here before. It's a different criticism than one emanating from the right. This is nothing to do with efficiency, inefficiency, too much power in too few hands, blah, 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 blah. This is using Marx himself to criticize the Marxists that come off the Marx. And what I just gave you arose in the 1960s in the East European countries by people roughly your age. They had read this literature as well as you've read it. Probably not as well as you've read it. They read it because it was difficult under the circumstances to read this stuff. They read this stuff, the Bernstein and Engels and so forth. And some of them began to say, okay, that's what Marx is arguing. They began in Poland, was the first place. These were members of the Communist Party in Poland, university students. They began to ask the question of themselves. Hey, listen, we've got collective ownership, we've got planning, we've got the vanguard of the Communist Party, we've got this equal pay for equal work, but it doesn't seem to us that the workers in industry, in those coal mines, in those steel factories, it doesn't seem to us that those workers, that the unions started out with very strong, it doesn't seem that those workers are the first receivers of the profits that they produce. And hence are the first distributors of the service. They don't have that in their hands. And they began to make a revolution. It took a long time. It took 25 years. It's really quite dramatic. It was a revolution that came from people using the very theories to question what they have. And that spread like wildfire to other countries in East Europe, and eventually even to the Soviet Union. And they were your age. So it wasn't just a passive exam. They actually put it into the streets of these respective countries, touched, a variety of other interests and so forth of people, and out of that came something really quite dramatic. But it was a criticism. It was a criticism that these are not socialist countries. That was the critique. It's fascinating. It is not true, what they said, true socialism, not because of the property issue, not because of the power issue, but rather because the claim was by the orthodox socialists that there was no exploitation because the workers automatically got the profits because they owned the means and they had power in the factories. Many of those people came back and said, yeah, we may own, that's under the law, we may have a lot of power, which they did, but what we don't have is the use value of our labor power, and hence we don't get the profits. You, state officials, get the profits, and you do with it as you want. We're not part of that distribution of the surplus because we don't appropriate it. So there was an anger in the factories and the offices over this abstract theorizing. Questions? Yes, sir.
In relation to, you said that if there was private ownership.
I'm sorry?
So that if there was private ownership in the
Yes.
this could still happen?
Yes, sir.
What would the benefit of being the owner?
Of being a private or collective owner?
Yeah, the use value goes straight. Why would you want to have?
Why would you want to have, say, collective ownership?
No, why would you want to have private? If you were
Well, suppose you would have to follow. Let's take our country. We have operated for a long period of time, way beyond your life and my life, for a couple of hundred years under private ownership. So that, I don't mean just not, once again, I don't mean just refrigerators. What I mean is private ownership of means of production. So, it's something we kind of almost take for granted. We're comfortable with it. So, stay with it. We're comfortable with private markets. So we had a discussion in class a while ago about, I understand markets create the business cycle, but markets also help to create innovations. As many of you said, it's contradictory. They do both. They help to give incentives for innovation, but they also arrest innovation by the business cycle. No, it's not one or the other. It's always both. Same thing with private property. It gives an incentive to work hard and to gain, but I understand it also concentrates an enormous amount of wealth in few hands, especially if you have single inheritance laws. Your father and mother may have worked real hard and amassed, property of $7 billion. That's the point. That's my point. Exactly your wish is my point. You see, they've worked hard, they've done all that, they'll leave it to you, but you make nothing. And hence you're going to inherit that enormous wealth, and you haven't done anything to warrant it. And that creates problems in society. So, here's the good aspect of property, ownership, private property, there's the bad aspect of it. I'm not arguing for or against either one of these. So you can have private ownership of the means of production, private markets, all the incentives. If you're a lover of private markets and private ownership, you have all these incentives present. And the only difference is you would have the workers in a position to receive the profits. By the way, what do the workers have to do with a portion of their profits if you have private property?
Reinvest it.
Yes, they have to reinvest it. What else? You've got private property over here, and you have, yeah?
Pay taxes.
Well, I mean, property, yeah? That's right. Absolutely. So you can be workers, you're sitting across all these boards of directors. If you have private ownership of the means of production, those workers have the right to vote you out. If we have, a similar one to the states. And hence, you've got to give a portion of the surplus in the form of a dividend to those private owners.
So instead of the owners of the means of production.
I'm sorry?
So basically, just instead of the owners of the means of production, determining what everything goes to. The workers, instead of the owners of the means of production, would be paying the owners of the means of production.
What is it? I'm not following. Do it again.
So basically, the owners of the means of production would be getting paid by the workers.
No. What, is that what you mean by dividend?
Yes.
Okay, yes, but it's not really, it's a dividend. It's really not.
That's the incentive to own the means of production.
Not quite. I gave you another one a while ago. There's too much in this course. But I gave you another incentive for private owners.
Pass it out.
Okay, that's the second one. I haven't mentioned that. There's a third one. You remember that? It's okay. Let's do that. You could have a tax system, okay, in this communist society, in which we have hefty taxes on income, and very small, if not zero, taxes on capital gains. This is what we have in the States. So if you get a dividend, you have to declare it on your income tax as your income and be taxed on it. Your income tax is a tax on your salaries plus dividends. If you, however, have a share of stock, private ownership, and you sell the stock for a higher price than what you purchased it, you make a zero gain. So you would be interested, if you were a taxpayer, on what as an incentive? And therefore you would prefer to have how much dividends?
More ownership.
Zero. And for the corporation to use its profits to pay zero dividends, but to use it, as someone said it, to reinvest in R&D and blah, 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 which would grow the corporation and grow the share price. And hence you would be in a neat position in which you could, if you wanted to, sell for capital gain.
Can you go over the difference of the fundamentals?
Yes. Okay. Anything else on this, though? This gentleman's important question. You've never heard this one, but I just did for you before, so you've got to be playing with it. It's a very important question that he asked. Yeah? Yeah.
What's the formal name for this?
I'm sorry?
What's the formal name you use for it? Surplus.
The communist fundamental class process?
Oh.
Okay, let's do it. Yes, sir.
Are there any practical methods or systems to have the workers receive the full?
Yes, but later on. Okay, I promised myself I would not do the details because I'm going to do it later on. Okay, so I will answer your question in a while. I'll give you the exquisite details of how it would work, best I can, but not yet. Yeah.
I'm still a little bit confused. So essentially, you say that it is possible to have this private ownership, have markets, but still have these communist fundamentals.
Correct.
Yeah. So you're saying doing this, you can still have owners of these corporations as well. But you're saying have these communist fundamentals, the workers must have the power, or should need to have the power to vote in power.
No, I'll do that now when I do the fundamental and the subsume. Did Mantra get in touch with you? Yeah. Did you write him? Okay, never mind. Okay, someone else then. I think if I did the fundamentals subsumed, you answer this question. Okay. The fundamental class process in your reading, that's got to do with the production and appropriation of this surplus. So it refers to the fundamental class process. It's a process. There are political processes, there are economic, there's cultural, and natural. This refers to a particular economic process called the class process. The fundamental class process refers to those who produce the surplus and those who appropriate it. In communism, that's the same collectivity. The same collectivity that produces, appropriates it. A capitalist class process is one in which the workers produce the surplus, but they do not appropriate it. So a different fundamental class appropriates it. In feudalism, the serfs produce the surplus, but the lords appropriate it. Only in communism does the same collectivity that produces also appropriates the surplus. So it refers then to who is producing and appropriating the surplus. And in communism, the who's are the same. And it's a collective production and appropriation. Because in the ancient, that petty mode that we talked about a long time ago, they are the individual producers and the individual appropriators. The subsumed class process refers, and only refers to, the distribution of the appropriated ED surplus. So the subsumed class process refers to the distribution of the surplus that has been appropriated. Go back to communism is then a class structure in which the workers produce and appropriate the surplus, then do it collectively as a group, same collectivity. But they also then are in the position to distribute the surplus because they have appropriated it. So there is a communist subsumed class process. In capitalism, the workers produce the surplus, but a different class. The class of capitalists appropriate it, and then that same capitalist class can distribute it because they're in the position to do so because they've appropriated it. Now, let's go back to capitalism for a moment. Deal with these issues. Let's take the issue of power that was just mentioned. In capitalism, number 9, the board of directors of the corporations, they both get the gross profit, the surplus, the $4. Why? Because they get the use value of labor power. So the board of directors, they buy the labor power, they give a wage, and lo and behold, it's like a golden goose. Golden goose. It gives us more gold than it costs to get it. If you give back a portion of the egg, that's the wages. But you're left with more than what you give back because the workers add a new value greater than the cost. That's the use value of labor power. The workers go to work, they labor for 8 hours, they have a certain value productivity, this I, the intensity of their labor, the 8 hours, and that yields $8. You get 8, you give 4, wow. Marx, as I told you a long time ago, Marx invented the top line. He invented this thing over here. The difference, labor power is a commodity, he invented the distinction between the wage, the value of the labor power, and the use value. No one had this. Adam Smith and David Ricardo, the two famous economists, they had this, they didn't have this. So the old man went to work a long time, and he invented the use value of labor power. Later on, in a letter to somebody, or actually it was to Engels, he said, this is my greatest invention. The difference between the use and exchange value of labor power. Yes, sir. Is it really on this? Because I want to try and answer it. Is it on this, though?
Yeah, I was going to say,
Okay.
is it safe to say that the capitalists knew they owned they have the top line?
Do they?
The owners of the means of production?
No. That's why I hold that aside. So just stick with the fundamental class process. So in capitalism, there's a group of individuals. How that comes about is interesting. But there's a group of people who get the use value of labor power. It's the board, how the board of directors becomes the board of directors. It's fascinating and interesting. For a moment, just accept it. I just want you to see the fundamental class process. That's all I'm after. This top line, the difference between the top line and this line. Notice, if this is $8, this is 0. There's a problem. So the top line has to be bigger than the bottom line for there to be a surplus, for there to be profits. So you can't give all the wages to the workers in capitalism, then the capitalists will die. So this has to be, whatever the number is, smaller for there to be a positive profit, whatever the number is. And then, by the same logic, if this is 0, and if this is 0, so the profits rise to $8, then the workers die, and then capitalism also collapses. There's a big range of what will be the wages and therefore profits. But all I'm after now is just this singular process, one process, a class process, which is the production, top line, okay, the production and appropriation of the surplus. The production of surplus, $8, $4, and then the who gets it. So whoever is in the position to get the use value of labor power gets that. In capitalism, then, it's socially contrived that a small group of individuals, maybe now, whatever, it's 22 people, sitting on an incorporated business would get the use value of the labor power because they're deemed, now I'm getting to it, politically and economically and culturally, to be the receivers of the profits. Now let's talk about power. The capitalists get the use value of labor power because they want the labor power commodity. And they get this $4 in surplus. Do they have the power? They get it, it's in their hands, the profits. Do they have the power to do whatever they want with that $4? Can they do whatever they want? What's your reason? Yeah, man.
Don't they still have all the bills, like the banks and the license stuff to pay for, just like the capitalists do?
That's right. They don't have the complete power. That is, they're subject to all kinds of influences upon them by other groups in society. For example, the state takes away some of their surplus. That's called a tax. And if they get the $4, the board of directors, and they say, oh, you ain't going to pay my taxes, they will go to jail. They don't have complete power at all. Let's take another one. They get the $4. The state passes a law. And the law says you have to take a portion of your surplus and you have to give it to an entity in society which is going to do something for workers whenever the workers need it. This is above and beyond. Let me do it again. Since it's one of the most important problems in the United States today. So let me repeat it. And I'm doing it in a very abstract way because it sounds weird. Then I'll do it in a concrete way and it won't sound so weird. Here's where the corporation, the board of directors of the corporation, is another example. It's not taxed. Under the law, they have to take a portion of their surplus and they have to give it to an institution to take care of workers whenever the workers have a need for something. That's called health care. So the corporation has to not only pay taxes to the state to get what the state provides, but under the law, they have to take a portion of the surplus and provide health care to the workers whenever the workers need health care above and beyond their copay, the workers' copay. As you all know, because you've been reading the papers, that's the fastest rate of growth of any expenditure by corporations. driving them crazy. That's why many of the larger corporations want Obama's health plan. Because it relieves the portion of surplus that they have to pay. In other words, they don't have complete power over that. Let's take another one. Owners of the means of production, the share owners, may, under certain circumstances, we want a higher dividend. We don't just want the capital gain. We want a higher dividend. They're retired. Their income taxes are very low. Now they want the dividends. They don't want to wait for capital gain because they're going to die. So they put pressure on the board of directors. They order them. If you don't give us a higher dividend, we'll sell a stock or we'll vote you out. State says if you don't pay taxes, you'll be arrested. We'll order your behavior by putting you in jail for a long period of time. The state and or union says if you don't pay for health care, we'll go on strike or you will have violated the contract. You have to pay Social Security taxes, you have to pay unemployment tax for unemployment compensation, and so forth, etc. So in other words, the board of directors in capitalism is always sharing its power. It doesn't have complete power. Power is a complicated thing. Before we break. Such is the case with communism. In communism, those workers would not, in the same logic applies, they would not have complete power. Power is always a complexity. If you had healthcare plans in communism, you would have pressure on the workers who receive the surplus to distribute a portion to take care of the health needs of the workers. If you had a state, a portion would have to be distributed to the state for infrastructure, education, and so on. The only difference is that in one case, the capitalists are under pressure, and in the other case, the workers are under pressure. And that's a major difference. I see you on Thursday.